This is one of the largest school examination boards in the world. It has graded India students for close to a century. And this year, for the first time, the way it grades the high school class 12 answer sheets went fully digital. Nearly 2 million students had their papers scanned and marked on a single online platform. Marks that decide college admissions, scholarships, entire careers, all flowing through one system. And that system was cracked wide open. Not by a state-sponsored hacking group, not with some exotic zero-day exploit. It was broken by people who simply opened the website's own code and read what was sitting inside it. A master password in plain text, a login you could walk straight past by changing a single word, student records you could pull up by changing one number in a link. Flaws so basic that you'll find every single one of them in the first few chapters of any basic web security course. That is why this turned into a national story, with student protest and a government inquiry. In this video, we'll go through exactly what was broken, why each flaw is dangerous, and how a system like this should actually have been built. And if you are early in your career, pay close attention, because none of these are exotic mistakes. These are the exact basic ones you are most likely to make yourself. Let's dive in. For decades, grading these exams was a fully physical process. Students wrote their answers on paper. Those sheets were bundled up and shipped to examiners, and teachers graded them by hand. This year, the last step moved online. The answer sheets are still written on paper, but now they get scanned into images and uploaded to a portal, where the examiners log in, pull up each sheet, and enter marks on screen, which then total automatically and flow into the final result. And that is what on-screen marking means. And on paper, it is a good idea. Less manual totaling, fewer lost sheets, faster results. But look at what it requires. This is a web application sitting on the public internet that anyone with a browser can reach. Unlike most web applications, it is built from a few standard parts. There's a front end, the code that runs inside your browser and draws the screens you see. There's a backend server, which is meant to be the brain, the part that makes the real decisions and guards the real data. There's a database holding accounts and marks. And there is a cloud storage holding every one of those scanned answer sheets. Now keep those four parts in mind: the front end, the server, the database, and the storage. Because every flaw we are about to walk through lives in one of them. Let us start with authentication, the front door. When you log into a secure system, here is what is supposed to happen. You send your credentials and your one-time password to the server. The server checks them, and then the server, and only the server, decides whether you are in. In this portal, part of that decision was being made on the client side, inside your own browser. To understand why that is fatal, you need one core idea. And it is the most important idea in this whole video: the trust boundary. Any code that runs on the user's machine, which means all of your front-end JavaScript, is fully under the control of whoever is using it. They can read it, pause it, and change it. So the moment your security depends on the client behaving honestly, you have already lost it. In practice, the attack looks like this. The login request goes out, the server sends back a response, and the front-end code reads that response to decide success or failure. With a basic intercepting proxy or even just the browser's developer tools, you catch that response in flight and flip the value from failure to success. The OTP check, the thing that is supposed to be the hard part, gets skipped entirely, because the part that was enforcing it was running in a place the attacker controls. The fix is a principle, not a patch. Authentication must be established and enforced on the server. The OTP is validated server-side. A session or a token is only issued after the server itself confirms everything. So treat your front-end as a display layer that can lie to you, because it can. And that first flaw had a partner. Sitting inside that front-end code was a hard-coded master password in plain text. Now, for some reason, a lot of people new to this assume front-end code is somehow private. It is not. Every line of JavaScript your site sends gets downloaded into the user's browser. Minifying it or bundling it does not hide it. Minification is not encryption. Anyone can open the source tab or pull the bundle directly and read it. So any secret you put in the front end, an API key, a database string, a master password, is effectively published to the public. And the fix is straightforward. Secrets live on the server, in environment variables, or a dedicated secrets manager. The front end should only ever hold a short-lived token that is scoped to that one user and expires quickly. If a value can be read by the client, stop treating it like a secret, because it's not. The third flaw is the most important one in this video. To understand it, you have to separate two ideas that beginners often blur together: authentication and authorization. Authentication is proving who you are. Authorization is what you are allowed to do once you're in. This portal handled authentication, more or less, but it largely skipped authorization at the level of individual records. An endpoint would take an ID from the request, an examiner ID, an application ID, a roll number, and return the matching record. But it never checked whether the person making the request was actually allowed to see that specific record. So you log in as yourself, then you change the ID in the request to a different number, and the server happily hands you someone else's data. Their account, their answer sheets, their personal details. This is called IDOR, Insecure Direct Object Reference. Its more formal name is Broken Object Level Authorization, and it sits at number 1 on the OWASP API Security Top 10. Number 1 out of everything. And here is why it is so common, which is the part I really want you to internalize. Your framework gives you login almost for free. But checking on every single request that this specific user is allowed to touch this specific object, that is your job. And it is easy to forget. It also hides during normal testing, because when you test your own account, the happy path works perfectly. The bug only appears when someone deliberately asks for an ID that is not theirs. The fix is discipline, applied everywhere. Every data access checks ownership on the server. The cleanest way is to scope your queries to the logged in user. So instead of give me record 4150, it becomes give me record 4150, but only if the owner is this authenticated user. If they do not own it, they get nothing back. Now, using random, unguessable IDs like UUIDs helps a little as defense in depth. But understand this clearly. An unguessable ID is not authorization. If the only thing protecting a record is that the number is hard to guess, you are still vulnerable. The check has to be explicit and it has to be on the server. The fourth flaw moves into the cloud, and this is the one with the biggest blast radius. All those scanned answer sheets and question papers had to be stored somewhere, and they were sitting in a cloud storage bucket on S3. Now, if you've never worked on AWS S3 before, S3 is Amazon's file storage service. Think of it like a giant Dropbox for applications or a giant storage room on the internet. Companies upload images, PDFs, documents, videos, and all kinds of files into it. That is basically what Amazon S3 is. You create a bucket, which is just a folder-like container, and you upload files into it. Images, PDFs, videos, scanned answer sheets, whatever you want. The reason so many companies use S3 is that it is cheap, reliable, and can store practically unlimited amounts of data. Every file you upload gets its own URL. And here's the important part. Whether someone can open the URL or not depends entirely on how you have configured access. And that's where all of this starts. Because cloud storage like S3 is supposed to be private by default when you set it up correctly. The failure here was a misconfiguration. And it had two layers. First, the files themselves were readable without authentication. But second, and this is the worst part, the bucket allowed listing. There is an operation called listObjects v2 that returns an inventory of everything in a bucket. Now, on a properly logged bucket, an anonymous user cannot call it. Here, they could, and the root of the bucket was listable. The difference between these two layers matters a lot. If the files are public but the bucket is not listable, an attacker has to guess each individual URL one by one. But if listing is open, they do not have to guess anything. They can paginate through the entire bucket and pull down every object methodically start to finish. And because multiple institutions were apparently sharing the same bucket, that one misconfiguration potentially exposed records far beyond a single board. So what should this look like in practice? The bucket should be private, period. Nobody on the internet should be able to browse it, list files, or access anything anonymously. And that is why services like S3 have features such as block public access. And in most cases, you turn them on and leave them on. Now let's say an examiner needs to view a specific answer sheet. They don't get direct access to the bucket. Instead, the application first verifies who they are and whether they are actually allowed to see that file. Only then does the server generate a temporary link. That link gives access to one file for a few minutes and then it expires. On top of that, the application itself should have only the permissions it absolutely needs. And ideally, each institution's data should be isolated rather than mixed together in one giant storage pool. The general principle is simple. Give the minimum access needed to the fewest resources possible for the shortest amount of time. Now, there is one more piece to this story. When the reevaluation portal came back online, officials claimed it was hit by denial of service attack. Roughly 1.5 million requests in 2 minutes, along with numerous unauthorized file access attempts. A denial of service attack or DOS isn't about stealing data. It's about availability. The goal is to overwhelm a system with so many requests that even legitimate users can't get through. And when the traffic comes from many machines at once, it's called Distributed Denial of Service Attack, or DDoS. A million plus requests in a couple of minutes is exactly the kind of pattern you would expect to see. And this is also a good place to separate three terms that often get mixed together. First, a vulnerability. It's a flaw in the system, whether anyone exploits it or not. Second is exploitation. Someone actually using that flaw to access data or functionality they shouldn't. Third, a denial of service attack. An attack on availability where the goal is simply to knock the system offline. A portal can have serious vulnerabilities and also be under DDoS attack at the same time. Those are different problems with different fixes. And importantly, we were under attack and our system had security flaws can both be true. One does not cancel out the other. And the defenses are different too. Rate limiting to slow, abusive traffic. Edge filtering through CDNs and web application firewalls and auto-scaling to absorb certain spikes. And that brings us to the big picture. Now let's step back, because all four of these failures are really the same failure wearing different clothes. The system trusted things it should not have trusted, and it failed to check things it should have checked. So the secure design comes down to one mental model. Draw a hard trust boundary and put the server on the trusted side of it, alone. Everything on the client is untrusted. The server is the single source of truth. It authenticates, it authorizes every request against the specific object being accessed. It holds the secrets and it brokers every file through short-lived, scoped links. Underneath that, you store credentials with a strong, slow hashing algorithm like bcrypt or argon2, never something fast and broken like MD5. And you assume failure anyway. So you add rate limiting, logging, and monitoring, so that one mistake gets caught early instead of quietly turning into a breach. That layering is what we call defense in depth. So what should a system like this actually do? Keep authentication and authorization on the server, not the front end. Check ownership on every request, not just some of them. Rotate exposed credentials, remove secrets from client code, lock down storage, and isolate data properly between institutions. Major security failures are rarely caused by one developer writing one bad line of code. They are usually organizational and system failures. And if this kind of thing you want to go deep on, that is exactly what we built inside Bytemonk Academy. The Cybersecurity for Developers course takes all of this: authentication, authorization, the OAuth API risk, secure cloud configuration, and turns it into hands-on skills built for engineers who are really in the journey. The system design course covers how to architect systems that are secure and scalable from the first diagram. And Bytemonk Unlimited gets you everything under one membership. Links are in the description. But the one thing to take away from this video is this: on every request, is your server verifying not only who the user is, but whether they are allowed to access that specific resource? Get that habit right and you'll prevent some of the most common security breaches on the internet. I'll see you in the next one.